what led to the assassination of Malcolm X. In February of 1946, a young man walked into his prison cell for the first time, without direction and without hope. Later, in August of 1952, a man stepped outside, looking around to see no walls for the first time in 6 years. His transformation from a lost soul to religious leader and activist was complete. This internal transition encapsulated in his name, for he stepped behind bars Malcolm Little, and now, upon his liberation, he marked his name with an X. The man we all now know him as today stood with a name superseding the label given to his ancestors by slave traders. After 6 years, which had been spent meticulously reading, learning, and following the teachings of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X had shaped his hardships into determination, his incarceration into dedication, and his oppression into activism. Upon his release from prison, Malcolm sought to visit his spiritual leader, Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad was a man who Malcolm had maintained regular correspondence with, and a man who stood as the leader of the Nation of Islam, a religious philosophy and moral principle Malcolm had devoted himself to during his time behind bars. Less than 1 year later, Malcolm X was appointed Assistant Minister in Nations Temple No. 1 in Detroit. The organisation advocated black empowerment and the separation of black and white Americans, something which Malcolm believed in after years of cruelty at the hands of white supremacist groups and a life of hardship at the hands of tyranny of an oppressive government. With the political and spiritual movement growing exponentially, Malcolm was able to quickly expand the following of his temple. Through his passion and oratory proficiency, he soon became one of the organisation's most instrumental members. With Malcolm's influence expanding and his rapid ascent in the Nation of Islam, he used his position to stand against any form of maltreatment black Americans had to endure. However, Malcolm expressed criticism towards Martin Luther King and the conventional civil rights movement, due to their conviction that racial integration and non-violence were the answer. As a result of these principles, alongside his rise in power and possible communist associations, commencing in the 1950s, the FBI began surveillance of Malcolm X, surveillance which he would endure until his death. Later in 1955, with hundreds of African Americans joining the Nation of Islam each month, Malcolm established another temple in Boston and expanded Temple No. 12 in Philadelphia. Thereafter, Malcolm became the leader of Temple No. 7 in Harlem, which resulted in an immense surge in members. His growing influence paralleled the growing ubiquity of the Nation of Islam, with Malcolm X later inspiring Cassius Clay to join the organisation, subsequently changing his name to Muhammad Ali, with Ali later stating, "Cassius Clay is a slave name. I didn't choose it and I don't want it. I am Muhammad Ali, a free name. It means beloved of God, and I insist people use it when people speak to me." Over the coming years, Malcolm X would be regarded as one of the most influential leaders of the Nation of Islam, second only to Elijah Muhammad. Later, Malcolm began mentoring the son of Elijah Muhammad and changed his name to Malcolm SHABAZZ. However, most still refer to him as Malcolm X. The general public would not become aware of Malcolm X until, in 1957, 2 New York City police officers beat a man named Hinton Johnson, who was a Black Nation of Islam member. Johnson had witnessed the police officers beating a young African American man and, determined to protect the young man, had stepped in. However, one police officer had attacked Johnson, leaving him with brain hemorrhaging. Johnson, the young man, and 2 other passers-by were subsequently arrested. After hearing of this, Malcolm X and a small group of African American Muslims gathered and marched to the police station. Upon arrival, they demanded to see Johnson. Despite initially denying Johnson's detainment, after the crowd grew to approximately 500 members, the police eventually allowed Malcolm to speak to him. Malcolm appealed to the officers, suggesting they should take him to hospital. Later, after receiving treatment, Johnson returned to the police station. By this time, roughly 4,000 people had amassed outside. After speaking to the attorney in order to make bail arrangements, Malcolm X walked outside, and with a hand signal, the crowd dispersed. Following this, Johnson wasn't bailed, and later, a jury declined to prosecute the officers responsible for the assault. Propelled into the public eye through adversity, less than a month later, Malcolm X was under the surveillance of the New York City Police Department. Thereafter, concerned after witnessing the extent of his influence, they dispersed undercover officers throughout the Nation of Islam. During this period in Malcolm's life, he married and had 6 daughters. Alongside his changing personal life, Malcolm, due to several television appearances and an ever-increasing following, began to gain international exposure. Standing at 6'3", Malcolm had a powerful physical presence. However, he predominantly gained respect as someone who spoke with passion and demanded influence through his words. Unlike Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X maintained that integration was not the answer and argued against King's support for non-violent activism. As a result, he became a controversial figure, but one who many African Americans felt addressed and empathized with their oppression more than the mainstream civil rights movement did. As a result, his following inevitably grew. Despite Malcolm's support and dedication to the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad, it would not be long before he grew disillusioned. In April 1962, after months of violent confrontations between Los Angeles police and the Nation of Islam members, just after midnight, 2 LAPD officers, without provocation, beat several Muslims outside Temple No. 27. After a crowd gathered outside and one officer was disarmed, approximately 70 officers arrived and raided the mosque. Police later shot several members, with one being paralyzed for life after being hit in the back. Another member, Ronald Stokes, a war veteran, was killed after police shot him while he was raising his hands to surrender. Following this, no officers were indicted for their involvement. A coroner later ruled the killing of Stokes as justified. Malcolm X was enraged with the senseless shooting of his people in their place of worship and the injustice which followed. He demanded action, utilizing his past life of crime alongside his connections to more hardline supporters of the organization. Malcolm rallied members and called for revenge against the police. Regarding this, Malcolm X approached Elijah Muhammad, hoping to receive his approval, to which Muhammad refused. Later, when Malcolm spoke of the Nation of Islam supporting civil rights movements, he again received the rejection of Muhammad. With the disciples' rise to leader, Elijah Muhammad began to see Malcolm as a threat. As a result of Malcolm's growing popularity through literature and the media, Muhammad grew envious. Catalyzed by their previous disagreements, Malcolm X became disillusioned. As a consequence of this and the reported sexual misconduct of Muhammad, he declared his separation from the Nation of Islam in early 1964. Criticizing the organization's uncompromising teachings, Malcolm X later expressed his desire to focus on political activism and work alongside other civil rights leaders. Despite his disillusion with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm remained a devoted Muslim throughout the remainder of his life. After his departure from the Nation of Islam organization, Malcolm established Muslim Mosque and the Organization of African American Unity, a group which supported Pan-Africanism. Over the following years, Malcolm X continued to increase his global influence, with his visits to Egypt, Paris, and the United Kingdom, in which he spoke of black independence and emancipation. Still a devout Muslim, Malcolm X also made a pilgrimage to Mecca, later explaining that seeing Muslims of all colours, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans, regarding each other as equals, had evoked a feeling that Islam may be a conduit through which racial oppression could be solved. Later, Malcolm X spent much of his time speaking at meetings, interviews, and debates. However, he faced a threat from those he once stood to represent. With his withdrawal from and criticism of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm had become a target for the organization's extremist followers. After a temple leader ordered the bombing of Malcolm's car, Elijah Muhammad, the man who once stood as a mentor to a youthful Malcolm X, stated that hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off. After several tip-offs that Malcolm's life was in danger, his home was burnt down for the second time in his life. This was not the first time Malcolm's life had been at risk. However, this time, the threat emerged from members of a group he was instrumental in expanding, an organization which he had dedicated so much of his life to, and a movement which he had hoped would inspire the liberation of African Americans. In December of 1964, Boston Nation of Islam member Louis X stated, "Such a man as Malcolm is worthy of death." In February 1965, Malcolm X said that the Nation of Islam was trying to kill him. Only 2 days later, Malcolm X would lay on the stage of Manhattan's Audubon Ballroom after being shot 21 times. Malcolm X will forever be remembered as a dedicated, brilliant, determined, and essential member in the fight for civil rights. While he left the world long before he should have, the presence of Malcolm X will always remain, in his teachings, his passion, and in his commitment to racial justice. Later, his ex-mentor, Elijah Muhammad, stated, "Malcolm X got just what he preached." Ironically, but somewhat unsurprisingly, the nation in which Malcolm sought to evoke the most positive change and the nation which was responsible for the oppression of its people was the one which would later respond most critically of his life, with the New York Times writing that Malcolm X was an extraordinary and twisted man who turned many true gifts to evil purpose, declaring that his life was strangely and pitifully wasted. However, many countries later considered Malcolm X a martyr, with the Ghanaian Times listing him among a host of Africans and Americans who were martyred in freedom's cause. A friend of Malcolm's, James Baldwin, said after his death, "You did it. It is because of you, the men that created this white supremacy, that this man is dead. You are not guilty, but you did it. Your mills, your cities, your rape of a continent started all this." Click here to watch our previous video explaining how the early life of Malcolm X inspired his activism.